Hey guys, tonight we journey into the harsh world of medieval times, not to marvel at castles or chivalry, but to uncover something grittier, more unsettling. While the Middle Ages gave us cathedrals and epic legends, they also birthed brutal laws, bizarre customs, and daily struggles that would break even the toughest among us. So, before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy exploring the raw side of history with me. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into a world where survival was anything but guaranteed. Witch prickers were paid to stab women with needles. In the shadows of early modern Europe, when the night crept in and fear ruled the flicker of every candle, there existed a profession so chilling, so cruel, that even its name sounds like a curse: witch pricker. Imagine a world where the accusation of witchcraft could turn a neighbor into an enemy, a rumor into a death sentence, and superstition into a business. Picture a time when the mere suspicion of consorting with dark forces could doom someone, especially if she was a woman who stood out, or spoke too boldly, or lived too freely. The witch pricker was not a judge, not a priest, not a protector of the law. He was a mercenary. A man paid to find the devil's mark with nothing but a needle and a ruthless determination to prove guilt, no matter the evidence, no matter the truth. When a village succumbed to hysteria, when crops failed or sickness spread, or an unexplained death shattered the community, suspicion spiraled into accusation. It was almost always women who paid the price. Some were healers, midwives, or widows. Others were simply unlucky, poor, outspoken, or friendless. Once accused, the machinery of terror rumbled into action. The accused would be stripped and examined, not by gentle hands, but by those of the witch pricker, a man summoned to deliver judgment disguised as science. The people believed witches bore marks, imperfections, blemishes, scars, moles, any spot that could be claimed as evidence of a pact with the devil. But not every mark would do. There had to be proof, and proof was defined not by what could be seen, but by what could be felt, or more precisely, what could not be felt. The witch pricker's tool was simple, almost innocent, a long, slender needle, sometimes even disguised as a dagger with a retractable blade. The ritual was as brutal as it was methodical. Before a hushed, trembling audience, the accused woman stood naked and exposed, her dignity already stolen. The pricker jabbed her skin, searching for the devil's mark. If she flinched, if she bled, it was declared normal. But if there was a patch of numbness, if she did not react, or if no blood welled from the wound, it was taken as ironclad proof. According to twisted logic, witches bore insensitive flesh, the spot where Satan kissed them, sealing their souls. In reality, these insensitive patches could be scars, calluses, or even the result of trauma or fear. And often the witch pricker was not interested in truth. Payment came only when witches were found. The more marks discovered, the more coin in his purse. The process was as corrupt as it was cruel. But it wasn't only the needle that did the damage. The entire ritual was designed to break the spirit as well as the body. Imagine the terror, stripped of clothes and dignity, surrounded by hostile faces, knowing that every wince, every gasp, every drop of blood would be scrutinized, twisted, and used against you. Some witch prickers were notorious for using retractable needles, tricking witnesses into believing their tools pierced flesh without leaving blood. To the assembled crowd, it was irrefutable proof of the supernatural. In truth, it was nothing but sleight of hand, a con designed to fill the pricker's purse and send women to the scaffold. This profession was not confined to the shadowy fringes of society. Witch prickers traveled from town to town, offering their services for a price. They were called experts, their verdicts trusted over the pleas of the accused. In Scotland, where the witch panic reached fever pitch in the 17th century, witch pricking became an industry. Some prickers, like the infamous John Kincaid, gained a reputation for unmasking dozens, even hundreds, of supposed witches. Their testimonies were rarely questioned. After all, they claimed to possess special knowledge, tools, and the gift of finding Satan's touch. Behind the cold routine of pricking, there lay deeper fears. The community needed a scapegoat for its misery, a vessel to absorb collective guilt and rage. The witch-pricker became both weapon and witness, a man who could channel the village's dread into a spectacle, a ritual of pain and humiliation that ended in execution or lifelong shame. And the condemned? Their fates were sealed long before the needle ever touched skin. History tells us that some women survived the ordeal, but many did not. Torture often followed the pricking, forcing confessions through agony and exhaustion. Those who refused to confess risked worse punishments. Their families were ruined, their names blackened forever. The scars, both physical and psychological, lasted for generations. It is easy, from the safety of the modern world, to recoil from these stories as distant nightmares. But the psychology that created witch-prickers lingers in every era, a hunger for certainty, for easy answers, for scapegoats. When fear reigns, justice withers, and cruelty becomes a profession. The witch-pricker's needle is gone, but its shadow remains. Today, we remember these women not as witches, but as victims of a society that weaponized pain and suspicion. We remember the hands that held the needle, not as instruments of justice, but as reminders of how quickly reason can be pierced by terror, and how truth can bleed away in the name of safety. In the end, the story of the witch-pricker is not just a story of history. It's a warning etched in flesh and memory about the dangers of fear, the power of accusation, and the price paid when cruelty becomes a career. This is the legacy of the witch-pricker, the blade, the blood, the silence, and the countless lives shattered by a lie made of steel. Swimming tests. Drowned. Innocent victims. In the murky dawn of early modern Europe, a chill wind blew through villages and towns, colder than winter itself. It was the breath of suspicion, a shadow that whispered of dark powers and unholy pacts, one that could turn neighbor against neighbor, mother against daughter, even priest against his own flock. In those centuries, the mere rumor of witchcraft was enough to unravel lives, to shatter families, to leave scars that would echo for generations. But among the many tools of persecution, none was more tragically ironic, more twisted in its logic, or more brutally final than the swimming test. Imagine standing on the muddy banks of a river, perhaps the village stream or a cold forest pond. Around you, a crowd gathers, not just the zealous inquisitors and grim officials, but the fearful, the curious, and the hungry for spectacle townsfolk. Someone, a woman most likely, though sometimes it was a man or even a child, stands in the center, bound hand and foot. She is shivering, but not from the cold. Her fate will be decided by the water, and the water alone. To modern ears, the very concept of the swimming test sounds like a nightmare, a cruel absurdity. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was justified by a web of religious beliefs, folk traditions, and desperate attempts to find certainty in a world full of invisible fears. The roots of this ordeal stretch back even further, to medieval Europe, when trial by water was used in cases of theft or murder. The idea was simple. Water, seen as a pure element, would reject that which was evil or unholy. By the time the witch panic swept across Europe, the belief had evolved. Now, water would reject the witch, refusing to let her sink. The accused was bound, sometimes with ropes, sometimes even sewn into a sack, and then lowered or thrown into the water. The eyes of the crowd never left her face as she struggled, her breath catching, her heart pounding. The logic was merciless. If she floated, the water had rejected her, proof she was in league with the devil, guilty of witchcraft. If she sank, the water had accepted her innocence, but by then she was almost certainly beyond rescue, lungs filled with water, her life ebbing away in a cold, silent grave beneath the surface. It's hard to overstate just how deeply people believed in this system, or how helpless the accused truly were. There was no room for protest, no way to refuse. Fear of witches was woven into the very fabric of daily life, from sermons in church to stories told by the fireside. The swimming test was not just a punishment, but a spectacle, a performance of righteousness, a desperate search for order in a world ruled by plague, famine, and war. For the authorities, it was a method that seemed both scientific and divine, cloaked in religious certainty but driven by paranoia. History records countless victims. In England, Germany, Poland, and across the Low Countries, the swimming test, or ordeal by cold water, became infamous. In some towns, dozens of women might be accused in a single summer, dragged from their homes in the middle of the night, stripped of dignity, and brought to the water. There are stories of mothers clutching their children as they were bound, of elderly women so frail they could not stand, yet still condemned to the river. In the worst cases, entire families were swept up in the madness, drowned together beneath a blanket of lies. The test itself was far from uniform. In some regions, the accused had a rope tied around their waist so they could be pulled out if they began to sink. But this was no act of mercy. Often the rope was simply to recover the body once the verdict was rendered. In other places, the crowd watched impassively as the condemned disappeared below the surface, their fate sealed long before they ever touched the water. Sometimes the accused survived, only to face execution by hanging or burning. In these cases, passing the test did not guarantee freedom. Surviving might even be considered further proof of supernatural protection. The psychology behind the swimming test was a toxic mix of ignorance and faith. Water was holy, so witches, supposedly allied with the devil, could not sink. But basic physics, never understood by the accusers, meant that a person bound and full of terror might float by chance or by struggling to breathe. Heavy clothing could drag someone down. Thin bodies or tightly bound arms could keep someone at the surface. There was no science here, only the illusion of certainty. But why did entire communities go along with such cruelty? The answer lies in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of difference, fear of blame. Witches were a scapegoat for every disaster, every failed harvest, every child who died before their time. In a world that seemed ruled by invisible forces, to accuse a witch was to fight back against chaos, to reclaim a sense of control. And once an accusation was made, the machinery of suspicion took over. Neighbors testified, friends turned away, and the accused was left utterly alone, their fate decided not by their actions, but by a tide of panic they could not escape. There are rare accounts of resistance, of priests or magistrates who refused to order the swimming test or who tried to protect the accused. But these voices were drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the relentless pressure to purge the community of evil. It did not matter if the victim was kind or generous or deeply religious. Once the suspicion took hold, even a lifetime of virtue was swept away by a single accusation. Consider the legacy of those waters. How many innocent lives were claimed, how many families destroyed. The rivers and ponds that witnessed these horrors have long since returned to silence, but the pain lingers in records, in folk memory, in the haunted stones of old villages. In some cases, those accused of witchcraft are remembered by name. Anne of Frankfurt, drowned despite her pleas. Maria of Lübeck, tied and thrown into the river as her children wept on the shore. Their stories are warnings, echoes of a time when justice turned upside down, when to be declared innocent was to pay the ultimate price. As the centuries passed, reason and skepticism began to challenge the old beliefs. The swimming test fell out of favor, condemned by legal scholars and clergy alike. It was recognized, finally, for what it was, a barbaric relic, a tool of murder wrapped in the language of law. But the damage was done. No apology could return the dead. No repentance could erase the terror that had gripped so many hearts. What can we learn from this dark chapter? That truth and justice are fragile, easily warped by fear and desperation. That once the machinery of accusation begins, it is almost impossible to stop. And that the true victims of the swimming test were not witches, but human beings, sisters, mothers, daughters, each with a story, each with a life that deserved to be lived. The water did not judge. It simply reflected back the madness of those who wielded it as a weapon. So the next time you pass a quiet river or see ripples on a pond, remember the voices lost to history, the innocents who drowned, not because they were guilty, but because a society allowed fear to drown reason. Their stories are a reminder that justice must never be surrendered to panic, that innocence must be protected, not punished, and that the cost of forgetting is paid in human lives. And above all, remember that beneath every accusation, every test, every tragedy, there is always a human heart, fragile, hopeful, and deserving of mercy, even when the world forgets. Entire villages turned on each other overnight. Imagine a world where the boundaries of trust and betrayal evaporate overnight, where the soft tap of your neighbor's shoes on the path outside could mean salvation or sudden doom. In the English villages of the 17th century, that nightmare was no mere fantasy. It was reality. Entire communities, men, women, children, turned on each other in a fevered frenzy of suspicion, fear, and the irresistible power of rumor. Names like Manningtree and Bury St. Edmunds became synonymous with mass hysteria, their streets haunted not by witches, but by the desperate human need to find an enemy when chaos erupts. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a whisper, something strange glimpsed at dusk, a cow falling ill, a child wasting away with no explanation. In an era without science, without medicine as we know it, every misfortune begged for a cause. And where there is unexplained suffering, human imagination will supply answers, no matter how terrible. In these tightly woven villages, the answer became witchcraft. The people you dined with, prayed with, worked beside, were suddenly not neighbors, they were potential agents of Satan. The shift was sudden. You could sense it in the air, a prickling cold that ran beneath daily conversation. Eyes narrowed, voices hushed, doors closed a little faster. The powerful machinery of fear had begun to move. It was fear that gripped the mothers of Manningtree when their children fell sick and prayers failed to heal. Fear that gnawed at the farmers when crops withered and livestock died mysteriously. Fear that curled around the heart of the widow living at the edge of town, already an outsider, now the perfect vessel for everyone's darkest suspicions. But fear alone was never enough. It needed a catalyst. In Manningtree, that spark came in the shape of a man, Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general. With a ruthless sense for opportunity, Hopkins traveled from village to village, offering his services for a fee. He wasn't just a man, he was a symbol, a promise of order in a world spiraling into chaos. Hopkins would listen to the rumors, collect whispered accusations, and then make them real. He would demand confessions, seek out devil's marks, orchestrate public spectacles of guilt and punishment. Soon the accusation became a kind of contagion. To accuse was to protect yourself. If you named another, maybe suspicion would pass over your own family. Maybe, just maybe, you would escape. One accusation led to another, and then another. Suddenly, a neighbor you'd known for years was shackled in the village square. Your friend's face, marked by terror and confusion, stared out from behind wooden bars, awaiting a fate worse than death, to be tried as a witch. There was no logic, no pattern. Any sign of eccentricity, any hint of difference could mark you as a target. The old woman who collected herbs for medicine, the unmarried mother, the midwife, the poor, these were the first to fall. But soon the dragnet widened. Once the machinery was set in motion, it needed fuel. Anyone with a grudge could whisper a name. Anyone with a secret could try to save themselves by pointing a trembling finger. In Bury St. Edmunds, the madness grew to its most chilling heights. The year was 1645. War had already torn the country apart, but in this town, the war turned inward. Within months, dozens were swept up in a tidal wave of accusations. Entire families were arrested. Husbands watched their wives hauled away. Children saw their mothers and grandmothers paraded through the streets as monsters. A single session of trials condemned 18 people to die by hanging, not for what they had done, but for what others feared they might be. The pressure was relentless. If you denied the charge, you must be lying. Why else would so many accuse you? If you confessed, perhaps you might save yourself by naming others. Fear bred confession, and confession bred more accusations in an endless loop that no one could escape. Friendships shattered, families divided. The village became a stage for the worst that people can do to one another when the invisible hand of terror closes around their throats. For those accused, the process was a living nightmare. Imprisoned in foul, overcrowded cells, they awaited examination by witchfinders and local authorities. Their bodies were searched for the smallest blemish. A mole, a scar, even a freckle could be called the devil's mark. Needles were jabbed into their flesh. They were kept awake for days, interrogated until the mind broke and the mouth uttered anything to make it stop. In some cases, the accused were forced to undergo swimming tests, thrown into rivers, their survival or drowning twisted into evidence against them. The trials themselves were little more than performances. The accused were presumed guilty. Hearsay was treated as fact. The courtrooms buzzed with tension, the community watching as one after another. Their neighbors were destroyed before their eyes. Sometimes, the same people who'd once shared bread and laughter now called for death, their voices shaking with relief that, at least for now, the mob's gaze was fixed elsewhere. But the terror did not stop at those accused. It infected the entire community. Children learned to mistrust their parents. Friends became strangers. Everyday life was poisoned by the unspoken knowledge that any misstep, any moment of ill fortune, could put you next in line. The normal rhythms of village life, work, worship, celebration, were replaced by suspicion, secrecy, and silent dread. Even after the executions, the scars did not fade. Families were left ruined, property confiscated, reputations shattered. The empty places at the hearth served as a warning. This could happen to anyone. Decades later, the old men and women of these villages would speak in hushed tones of what they'd seen, the horror of watching a neighbor led to the gallows, the shame of a community that had lost itself to fear. Looking back, it is easy to imagine that such madness could only happen in a distant, primitive past. But history whispers a darker truth. What happened in Manningtree and Bury St. Edmunds was not unique, nor was it inevitable. It was the product of ordinary people, driven to extraordinary cruelty, by terror, by uncertainty, and by the irresistible seduction of believing that evil always wears someone else's face. The lesson lingers, haunting and unresolved. In times of chaos, the greatest danger comes not from monsters lurking in the shadows, but from the human mind, desperate to find meaning where none exists. In those long, fearful nights, the real witchcraft was not what the accused were said to practice, but what fear and rumor could do to the bonds between neighbors. One by one, trust shattered, suspicion took root, and the village, once united by hardship and hope, became a battlefield, each soul fending for itself. What remains are not just the records of trials or the lists of the dead, but the silent ache of all that was lost. The warmth of friendship, the safety of belonging, the fragile trust that holds a community together. In every whispered accusation, every hasty confession, every desperate glance, you can still feel the echo of those nights, when entire villages turned on each other and humanity's darkest instincts were unleashed in the name of survival. Let the memory of Manningtree and Bury St. Edmunds stand as a warning, one that demands we never forget how quickly fear can turn us into strangers, and how, when trust dissolves, even the closest village can become a wilderness more terrifying than any tale of witches ever told. Matthew Hopkins executed over 100 women in just 2 years. In the shadowy heart of 17th century England, the air grew heavy with suspicion, fear, and the relentless whisper of accusation. It was a time when war raged, crops failed, and the wounds of a nation divided by civil conflict festered in every village. In this climate of chaos, one man's name would become synonymous with terror. Matthew Hopkins, a man who crowned himself Witchfinder General. In just 3 short years, from 1644 to 1647, he would leave a scar across the English countryside, orchestrating one of the most infamous and deadly witch hunts in British history. The world into which Hopkins stepped was already teetering on the edge. The English Civil War split families and neighbors, with royalist and parliamentarian loyalties carving rifts into communities. Disease, crop failures, and grinding poverty gave rise to a desperate need for explanations, for scapegoats, for someone to blame when misfortune struck. In this dark, uncertain environment, the belief in witches was not just a superstition, but a lived reality. People truly believed that the miseries of life were the work of dark forces, and that Satan himself prowled among them, recruiting agents to do his bidding. Matthew Hopkins was not a judge, a priest, or a royal official. He was the son of a Puritan minister, trained in the law but never a lawyer. Little is known about his early life, but what is certain is that by 1644, Hopkins saw an opportunity, one that would allow him to wield extraordinary power. He styled himself as Witchfinder General, a title with no legal standing but immense persuasive force. Armed with self-importance and a chilling sense of destiny, he swept into East Anglia, the counties of Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, igniting a wildfire of suspicion. His methods were both theatrical and cruel. Hopkins and his associate, John Stern, traveled from town to town, offering their services to anxious magistrates and villagers. In exchange for substantial fees and expenses paid by the very communities they visited, they would identify, interrogate, and ultimately destroy the women they accused. The process always began with rumors: a child who sickened suddenly, a cow that failed to give milk, a storm that ruined the harvest. In the world of the witch hunt, coincidence and calamity became evidence. Once suspicion was seated, Hopkins took command. The interrogations that followed were a harrowing spectacle. There was no need for proof, only for confession. Hopkins and his team employed tactics that skirted, or outright violated, the law of the time. The infamous swimming test was often used. Accused women were bound and cast into cold rivers or ponds. If they floated, they were considered rejected by the water, marked as witches. If they sank, they might be innocent, but the ordeal could kill them anyway. Other methods were more insidious. The accused were deprived of sleep for days, kept awake by constant questioning, denied food or warmth, worn down until exhaustion and terror made resistance impossible. Perhaps most chilling was the search for the devil's mark, a mole, birthmark, or blemish that, in the fevered logic of the day, proved a pact with Satan. Hopkins employed witch prickers, men paid to stab needles or knives into women's flesh, searching for spots that would not bleed or cause pain. The very tools of examination were sometimes rigged, the victims already doomed before the test began. There were no lawyers, no real defense. Families who tried to intervene risked accusations themselves. Once accused, women, mostly the poor, the old, the widowed, or the outspoken, were swept into a nightmarish process with almost no hope of escape. Between 1644 and 1647, the Hopkins witch hunts led directly to the execution of more than 100 women, more than the previous 100 years of English history combined. These deaths were not isolated. They triggered a wave of fear that rolled through dozens of communities. In Manningtree, the place most associated with Hopkins, the hysteria was so intense that neighbors informed on one another, mothers were torn from children, and friends became enemies overnight. The terror was not just physical, but psychological. The mere rumor of Hopkins's arrival was enough to empty streets, to send villagers fleeing or hiding, desperate to avoid his attention. Hopkins and his assistants thrived on this panic, profiting from the very fear they created. They were paid by the accusation, by the mile, by the corpse. They published a chilling pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, to justify their actions and further fuel the public's obsession with rooting out hidden evil. For Hopkins, witch hunting was business, theater, and self-justification all rolled into one. The impact was catastrophic. In some villages, so many women were executed that entire families were shattered, the social fabric ripped apart. The wider effect was just as dark. Trust in neighborly goodwill was replaced by a grim vigilance as everyone wondered who might be next. And yet, even as Hopkins' influence spread, cracks began to appear. Some clergymen and local leaders grew uncomfortable with the sheer scale of the executions and the lack of legal process. Skeptics whispered that Hopkins' methods were little more than torture, his evidence conjured from thin air. A few brave souls spoke out, questioning his authority and his morality. Gradually, the tide of public opinion began to turn. In 1647, Hopkins published his final pamphlet and faded from the scene. Some say he died of tuberculosis that same year, still a young man. Others claim he was hounded by the ghosts of those he condemned, never able to outrun the horror he had unleashed. But the devastation Hopkins wrought did not disappear with him. For years, the memory of his witch hunts lingered in the collective mind of England. Entire communities bore the scars: empty houses, motherless children, and a haunting knowledge that for a time the law had abandoned justice for panic. The panic that Hopkins unleashed would echo in popular memory for centuries. The towns he visited, Manningtree, Bury St. Edmunds, Chelmsford, and many more, would never quite forget how quickly ordinary life could turn monstrous, how suspicion could destroy, and how a single man's ambition could weaponize the darkest fears of an age. The legacy of Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general, remains a chilling lesson in the power of hysteria, the danger of unchecked authority, and the profound human cost of collective fear. He was a man who thrived in the shadows of his society's anxieties, who understood how to twist suffering into spectacle, and who left behind not justice, but a legacy of pain and silence. The story of his brief but deadly reign is a reminder that even in the most civilized of times, the boundaries between reason and madness, justice and vengeance can dissolve in an instant, leaving only the silence of those who did not survive to tell their side of history. And as the centuries have passed, the question remains: what would we have done had Hopkins come to our village, knocking at our doors, holding up the mirror of suspicion, and asking us to choose between fear and truth? In the end, the story of Matthew Hopkins is not just about witches, or even about one man's cruelty. It is about the dark places we can go when fear is allowed to rule, when justice bows to rumor, and when humanity forgets its own capacity for mercy. In remembering those lost, we are called to be vigilant, to question, and to guard against the return of such darkness, so that history, though it whispers, is never allowed to repeat. Children were forced to testify against their own mothers. In the bleakest corners of 17th century England, when shadows seemed to crawl along the cobblestones and superstition drowned out reason, there was a terror so insidious it crept into the hearts of families and tore them apart from the inside. Imagine a world where a child's trembling voice could become the sharpest weapon, where even the softest whisper, twisted by panic or poisoned by suggestion, could decide whether a mother lived or died. The witch trials, infamous for their cruelty, reached a chilling new depth when they began to force children, some no older than 6, to testify against their own mothers. In the small towns and villages across East Anglia, the air was heavy with suspicion. A sudden illness, a bad harvest, a storm, anything that could not be easily explained became fertile ground for accusations of witchcraft. But as the witch hunts intensified and the demand for confessions grew, the authorities began to look for new ways to extract evidence, however unreliable or tragic the source. Children, innocent and vulnerable, quickly became the perfect instruments. They could be manipulated, threatened, or frightened into saying what the interrogators wanted to hear. In a candlelit chamber, a magistrate leans forward, his voice a soft whisper, promising protection if the child simply tells the truth. Sometimes he threatens with tales of devils and hellfire. Sometimes he offers sweets or the promise of going home if the child just agrees. In other cases, the child is forced to listen to the screams of other accused women. Some children are told that if they don't confess what the adults want, their own souls, or even their lives, will be in danger. It is a horrifying web of psychological torment, and the consequences are irreversible. Once the first frightened words leave a child's lips, there is no way to take them back. In the records of the infamous East Anglian witch hunts led by Matthew Hopkins, we see testimony after testimony where children, trembling with fear, described impossible scenes. Mothers flying through the night on broomsticks, feeding their familiars with their own blood, summoning spirits in the dark. In the case of Elizabeth Clark, a crippled old woman from Essex, the entire prosecution rested on the confused testimony of a handful of terrified children. The children described seeing imps and spirits sent by Elizabeth to torment them, their stories growing more elaborate with each interrogation. But this was not unique to England. In the 1692 Salem witch trials in colonial America, children's testimonies became the linchpin of the entire tragedy. Girls as young as 9 claimed to see specters, to feel pinches and bites from invisible assailants. Their accusations were accepted without question by the authorities, because who, they reasoned, would corrupt a child's innocence? The answer, of course, was the very adults who used those children as weapons against their own kin. In the chaos of Salem, little Dorothy Good, only 4 years old, was dragged before the court and interrogated for hours. She became the youngest accused in American witch trial history. Her testimony and those of others sent dozens to the gallows, including her own mother. Why would children do this? To understand, you have to place yourself in the trembling shoes of a 6-year-old, surrounded by adults whose faces are masks of fear and rage, whose voices demand impossible stories. The children were trapped. Some genuinely believed the stories they were coached to tell, unable to separate nightmare from reality, especially after repeated questioning. Others spoke out of desperate self-preservation, hoping that by pleasing the adults, they could protect themselves from the very fate awaiting their mothers. Sometimes the children were not coached, but manipulated through sheer terror. They were isolated, told that their mothers were already guilty, that only their words could save their souls. They were shown torture devices or forced to watch the public humiliation of other accused women. In these circumstances, the human mind, especially the mind of a child, can be made to say almost anything. The courts did not care about the contradictions or impossibilities in their stories. They were not looking for truth. They were looking for evidence, for proof that their worldview, the world of devils, demons, and witchcraft, was real. And so a child's testimony could send an entire family to the gallows. What happened to these children afterward? History rarely records their names, and even more rarely, their fates. But in a world built on trauma, these children lived on with the unbearable guilt of what they had been forced to do. Some grew up believing that they really had seen their mothers consorting with the devil, their childhoods rewritten by the trauma of the trials. Others, as they grew older, came to realize the truth, that their own words, spoken under duress or in confusion, had led to the execution of someone they loved. One tragic example comes from Manningtree, the heartland of the English witch panic. Here, the daughter of an accused woman named Anne West was compelled to testify against her mother. The girl, barely old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, was told again and again that her mother was a witch, that only by confessing could she save her own soul. The girl broke down in tears and agreed to whatever the magistrates wanted. Anne West was hanged within days. The use of children's testimony was not an accident or a last resort. It became a preferred method for extracting confessions and evidence in the witch panic. For the authorities, it was a shortcut. Children, stripped of power and isolated from support, could be shaped into the perfect witnesses. The law, which should have protected them, instead used them as pawns in a game of fear and power. This tactic turned the basic fabric of society, family, against itself. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, but nothing compares to the betrayal forced between parent and child. The witch trials were not just a story of legal corruption or religious zealotry. They were a story of the destruction of trust at the most intimate level. Once, a mother might have soothed her child's nightmares. Now, the child's nightmares sent her to the scaffold. Even after the fever of witch trials passed, the scars remained. Survivors of these events often carried a lifelong burden of shame and grief, unable to speak of what had happened. In some towns, the silence lasted for generations. The memory of what had been done, of children forced to become the instruments of their own family's destruction, became a wound that never fully healed. Modern historians, looking back on these dark years, see the forced testimony of children as one of the most tragic and revealing aspects of the witch hunts. It was the ultimate weapon of a society in the grip of hysteria, a tool that turned innocence into guilt, love into fear, and family into a battlefield. When you hear about the witch trials, it is easy to imagine fire and shouting mobs, but the true terror was often quieter. The trembling of a child's lip, the silent tears of a mother facing her own death at the hands of her child's words. There are records, court transcripts, letters, fragments of testimony that let us peer into those rooms where innocence was sacrificed for fear. In the end, the witch trials remind us how quickly reason can vanish when panic and superstition take hold, and how in the wrong hands even the purest voices can be turned into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. Today, when we look back at these events, it is not just a story about witches or magic. It is a lesson in the dangers of unchecked authority, the vulnerability of the powerless, and the desperate primal bond between mother and child, a bond that in those terrible years was tested and shattered by the darkness of history. And perhaps most haunting of all, it is a reminder that the most innocent voices can be made to echo with horror, and that even love can be twisted into a weapon by the machinery of fear. Accused witches were starved and kept awake for days. The cell is cold. The walls drip with damp, ancient stones pressing in like a tomb. There is no bed, no blanket, not even a straw mat to soften the hard ground. In the corner, a woman curls her body as tightly as she can, hugging her knees to her chest, shivering beneath threadbare rags. The air tastes of mold and old fear, and the door is always closed, except when they come. She doesn't know if it's night or day. The darkness never changes. But she knows how long she's been here, not in days or hours, but in heartbeats and the gnawing ache of hunger that never lets her rest. This is not a fantasy, not a nightmare conjured by a storyteller, but a reality faced by thousands of women in early modern Europe during the height of the witch hunts. The story is older than any fairy tale. In a world where superstition masqueraded as justice and the cry of witch was a death sentence, the slow torture of sleep and food deprivation became a favored tool of inquisitors. It wasn't about truth, it wasn't about proof, it was about breaking the mind, shattering a person's sense of reality so completely that she would confess to anything, even the impossible, just to make it stop. Why deprive someone of sleep? Why starve them? Because sleep is not just rest, it is the brain's only defense against madness. Without sleep, the mind crumbles, thoughts blur, hallucinations crawl out from the shadows of consciousness, reason evaporates. Starvation adds another layer: pain, weakness, disorientation. With every passing hour, the body turns against itself, devouring muscle, draining hope. When both food and sleep are stolen, even the strongest will begins to collapse. The accused witch is caught in a spiral, too exhausted to resist, too hungry to focus, too desperate to care about anything except relief. In many witch trials, especially in Scotland, Germany, and the Germanic lands, this was not an accident or excess, it was procedure. The authorities didn't need visible wounds to justify their cruelty. Instead, they designed rituals of exhaustion, calculated to produce confessions while leaving the outward appearance of mercy. The logic was as twisted as it was effective. Physical torture might leave marks, but the ravages of starvation and sleep deprivation could be disguised as weakness or madness. That way, the confession would seem voluntary when it was anything but. The records are harrowing. Women, sometimes mere girls, were dragged from their homes and thrown into cells barely fit for animals. Their names were stripped away, replaced by the title, witch. The process began with endless questioning, round after round, day and night, overseen by men who called themselves righteous. The accused was not allowed to sleep. Guards or interrogators watched for any sign of drowsiness. If her eyes closed, she was shaken, slapped, forced to stand, marched around the room until her legs buckled beneath her. Sometimes women were tied to chairs or forced to stand in one spot for hours or days, forbidden to sit, denied even the most basic comfort. Food was rationed to the barest minimum, if given at all. Sometimes days would pass with nothing but water. The logic was brutally simple. A mind deprived of nourishment is more likely to fracture, to slip into confusion, to surrender in exchange for the smallest kindness. Hallucinations would begin, visions of devils, phantoms, memories twisted into nightmares, and all the while the questions kept coming. When did you meet the devil? What spells have you cast? Who are your accomplices? The interrogators knew the answer didn't matter. They only wanted a confession. And so, after days without sleep, with a stomach twisted in knots and a mind frayed to the edge of sanity, the accused would finally break. Some confessed to flying through the air, to attending midnight Sabbaths, to transforming into animals, to curses that killed cattle or sickened children. Many confessed to whatever was suggested, desperately hoping that submission would buy an end to the ordeal. Some even began to believe the stories themselves. Caught in the grip of delirium, unsure what was real and what was hallucination. These confessions, wrung from the most vulnerable moment a human can endure, became the evidence that fueled the fire of the witch hunts. And the world believed. Judges, priests, neighbors, many accepted these confessions as proof that evil stalked the land. They believed the devil was real, that he walked among them, hidden in the bodies of their sisters, wives, and daughters. The logic was circular and inescapable. Only a witch would confess to such crimes, and only torture could force the truth from her lips. But there were those who saw the truth. Some chroniclers, doctors, and even a few brave magistrates recognized the effects of sleep deprivation and starvation, noting that confessions were nothing more than the ravings of broken minds. They understood that under such conditions, anyone could be made to say anything. But their voices were drowned out by the tide of fear and hysteria. The machinery of accusation rolled on. The legacy of this horror is not just in the names written in trial records or the bones buried beneath ancient gallows. It is in the psychology of power, the realization that you don't need to break bones to break a person. You can destroy the mind more thoroughly with silence, with sleeplessness, with an empty belly, and an endless night. This is why sleep deprivation and starvation are still used, even now, in places where power seeks to crush dissent. It is the most invisible, deniable form of torture, a wound that does not bleed, but scars forever. History tells us the fates of these women. Some died before they could be executed, their bodies wasting away in the darkness. Others were carried to trial on shaking legs, condemned by the very words they had been forced to speak. Even those who survived, rare, lucky, forever changed, carried the mark of the ordeal for the rest of their lives. Their communities did not welcome them back. Their families, if they survived, found themselves shunned. Today, when we remember the witch hunts, we must look past the flames and the nooses and the torture devices. We must remember the darkness of the cell, the weight of sleepless nights, the hollow ache of hunger that carved away resistance and left only the will to say anything, confess anything, in exchange for mercy. We must remember that cruelty often wears the mask of necessity, that evil sometimes pretends to be righteous, and that history is filled with voices broken by the simplest, most insidious torments. This is the legacy of those accused as witches, not just the ashes of the stake, but the silence of starvation, the endlessness of night, and the confessions wrung from despair, echoing through history as a warning that even the smallest, quietest forms of cruelty can destroy lives more thoroughly than any sword. And if we do not remember, if we do not learn, then the darkness never really leaves. It simply waits for the next knock at the door, the next accusation, the next long, sleepless night. Women were hanged just for owning a cat. In the shadowy corners of Europe's medieval villages, the line between ordinary life and deadly suspicion was as thin as a cat's whisker. Imagine a woman alone in her cottage, kneeling beside the hearth with a small, hungry animal in her arms. She breaks off a crust of bread, offering it to a black cat whose eyes gleam like coals in the firelight. The scene is gentle, almost mundane. But in those centuries, such an act was fraught with peril. For to feed a cat, to befriend one, or even to be seen in its company at the wrong hour could mark a woman for death. The accusation could begin with a whisper, a sidelong glance, or the wary eye of a neighbor unable to make sense of her kindness. Fear fed on rumor, and rumor became weapon. "She keeps a familiar," they would murmur. "The devil's creature comes to her door." The cat, a symbol of independence and mystery, was transformed in the public mind into an agent of darkness. To love one was to risk your life. Across Europe, but especially in England and Scotland, the myth of the witch's familiar took hold. Authorities taught that witches were never alone. They were aided by demonic spirits who took animal forms, cats most often, but also toads, dogs, ferrets, or mice. The black cat, in particular, was seen as a devil's agent, capable of slipping between worlds, carrying curses, and bringing death. In courtrooms and pamphlets, stories spread of women whose cats were said to suckle blood from a secret mark or whisper dark secrets in the night. Sometimes the accusations were so absurd, so imaginative, that they feel almost surreal now. A neighbor testifying that a cat entered through a locked door or that it vanished into thin air when threatened. But the consequences were all too real. Hundreds of women, sometimes entire families, were accused. A farmer might find his milk spoiled, his crops blighted, and look for someone to blame. If a solitary woman lived nearby, and if she kept a cat, especially if she was old, poor, or seen as different, the accusation was nearly inevitable. The authorities needed little proof. Evidence could be as thin as the word of a child or the finding of a scratch on the woman's hand. In many cases, women were interrogated for hours or days, deprived of sleep, threatened, tortured. Their pets, if caught, were sometimes killed alongside them, hanged or burned in public squares to purge the evil. The fear was contagious. If a woman insisted her cat was nothing more than a companion, she was accused of lying, another sign of guilt. Execution was not rare. Hanging was the most common fate, especially in England. Women as young as 14 or as old as 70 were led to the scaffold, condemned not for violence or crime, but for companionship with an animal. The records are chilling. Elizabeth Lowes of Essex, hanged in 1565, was accused of feeding her cat strange meats. Agnes Waterhouse, the first woman executed for witchcraft in England, supposedly sent her cat named Satan to torment her enemies. The line between myth and reality blurred until no defense was possible. Women wept for their pets as they awaited death, while crowds jeered and clergymen prayed for their souls. The witch hunts reached a fever pitch during times of crisis: war, plague, famine. When life was fragile, society craved a scapegoat. Cats, once prized for killing vermin, became symbols of plague and evil. Authorities even ordered the mass slaughter of cats, unwittingly worsening the spread of disease by removing natural predators. The horror of this logic is almost unbearable. Every act of kindness, every shared meal or gentle word could become evidence of dark power. But beneath this cruelty lay deeper fears. Independent women, those who lived alone, who healed with herbs, or who simply refused to obey, were threats to a world ruled by rigid order. The cat was their mirror, solitary, fierce, unpredictable. To love a cat was to claim a sliver of freedom. And that, in a world built on control, was unforgivable. The last cries of both women and cats echo down the centuries. Today, we look back in disbelief, struggling to grasp a world where love for a pet could be twisted into a death sentence. But those echoes remain, reminding us that suspicion, fear, and cruelty always find new forms. The story of the women hanged for owning cats is not just history. It is a warning, a truth as dark, enduring, and sharp as a cat's cry in the night. Witches were blamed for failed crops and dead livestock. Close your eyes and imagine a world without certainty. No forecasts, no science to protect you from the whims of the earth, no safety net when disaster struck. You live in a small village, surrounded by fields you have tended since childhood. Every stalk of wheat, every bleating sheep, every cow in your barn is not just your livelihood. It is your family's survival, the thin thread holding your entire world together. In this world, the weather is unpredictable, the soil is temperamental, and misfortune always lurks just beyond the horizon. You wake before dawn and walk the furrows of your land, searching for hope. But on this day, something is wrong. A pale frost clings to the shoots that just yesterday promised a rich harvest. Your cattle are restless, one already lying still and cold before the sun rises. Your neighbors gather in the mist, faces pale and drawn, eyes searching the horizon for a reason, something, someone to blame. The priest mutters about God's wrath, but there is another, more immediate fear, one whispered in kitchens and at wellside. Witchcraft. This is not just a story. For centuries, in countless villages across England and Europe, these scenes played out over and over again. Whenever crops failed or livestock sickened, the pressure to explain the catastrophe was overwhelming. People could not accept randomness. Every disaster demanded a culprit. And so suspicion turned not to the unseen forces of nature, but to the people living in the shadows of society. The elderly widow, the strange healer, the woman who spoke too freely or too little. In a world where hunger was never far away, a single failed harvest could spell death for an entire community. The margins were razor thin, and famine was a living memory for almost every villager. When the weather turned or a disease swept through the fields and barns, it triggered a spiral of anxiety and fear that quickly needed to find an outlet. If prayers failed and traditional remedies brought no relief, people looked for a cause they could see, touch, and most of all, punish. It was all too easy for fear to turn into accusation. Someone remembered a quarrel with a neighbor, a strange look from an old woman, or an argument that ended with a muttered curse. In times of desperation, memory itself became a weapon, reshaping the past to fit the needs of the present. The very people who'd once shared bread and company could become the targets of lethal suspicion. Suddenly, a misfortune was no longer just bad luck. It was the work of a witch. If a cow sickened and died, people asked who had passed by the barn at dusk. If a frost struck only certain fields, the villagers wondered who had last walked the path that skirted those plots. If the beer soured or the bread failed to rise, suspicion fell on the woman who sold herbs at the edge of the market, or the mother whose children never seemed to get sick, or the outsider who always watched but never spoke. A single unlucky glance could be all it took. But it was never just one event. The process was cumulative, building over weeks, months, sometimes years. Every misfortune, an animal lost to disease, a child stricken with fever, a cartwheel that broke at a crucial moment, was added to the ledger of suspicion. Rumors multiplied and hardened. The community, desperate for control in a world spinning out of their grasp, became a crucible of anxiety and fear. Once the cry of witchcraft was raised, the machinery of accusation moved swiftly. Neighbors came forward with stories, real or imagined, of strange lights, odd behaviors, or ancient grudges. Old injuries were brought up, every quarrel given a sinister meaning. The accused, often women living on the margins of society, had little hope of defense. The legal system itself was stacked against them. Hearsay was treated as evidence. The absence of guilt was itself considered suspicious. Why would the innocent be so calm? Why would the guilty protest so much? The consequences were horrifying. In the space of days, someone could go from a respected if peculiar neighbor to a condemned criminal. They were dragged before magistrates, forced to undergo impossible tests. Their bodies searched for devil's marks, birthmarks, scars, any small imperfection that could be twisted into proof of guilt. Confessions were often extracted through sleep deprivation, intimidation, or even torture. The very structure of the community, its bonds of trust and mutual aid, was ripped apart. But the greatest tragedy was that the true cause of the disaster, disease, weather, simple misfortune, was lost amid the frenzy. No one was safe. In the early 1600s, places like Pendle in Lancashire and the villages around East Anglia became infamous for witch hunts sparked by failed harvests and animal deaths. In one case after another, food shortages or cattle plague led to panic, and panic led to executions. The same pattern appeared across Europe, in Germany, in France, in the Scandinavian north. Sometimes the entire process was so swift and brutal that within a few months, a village would lose not just a scapegoat, but a sense of its own humanity. In small communities, the hangings and burnings left empty houses, grieving children, and a legacy of trauma that lingered for generations. Even after the fever had passed, people remembered what it felt like to see an innocent person destroyed, not by witches, but by their own neighbors, driven by hunger and fear. In these desperate times, people turned not only to the courts, but to cunning folk. Local healers or wise men and women said to know both cures and curses. Ironically, these same people could themselves become suspects, their knowledge now seen as evidence of a pact with dark forces. You can imagine the fear in their eyes as the mob drew near, the crushing sense of injustice as their skills, once valued, now marked them for death. And always there was the chilling logic that to remove the witch would restore fortune. Villagers watched anxiously after an execution. Did the rains come? Did the cattle recover? When the disasters continued, the search for another witch began. In this way, the cycle fed on itself, growing ever more intense and irrational. Looking back, we see a world not of monsters, but of ordinary people driven to monstrous acts by circumstances they could not understand or control. The story is not just about failed crops or dead livestock, but about the profound human need to find meaning in suffering, to control what cannot be controlled, and to banish fear by offering up a sacrifice. In the cold logic of survival, compassion was often the first casualty. This history is not as distant as it seems. Even today, echoes of these fears linger in how societies handle crisis and disaster. When the future is uncertain, when hunger or disease threaten, the urge to blame someone, anyone, remains a powerful and dangerous force. So next time you hear the wind in the trees or watch the rain fail to fall, remember the innocent lives caught in the storms of history, destroyed not by magic but by the ancient, ever-returning hunger for certainty in a world that offers none. The ghosts of those accused and condemned still whisper in the silence of abandoned barns and fallow fields, warning us of what happens when fear rules reason, and when the desperate search for answers turns neighbor against neighbor in the darkest hours of human need. Pregnant women were not spared the noose. In the shadowed corners of England's judicial past, there lies a practice so cold, so unflinching, that it can still chill the blood centuries later. While some European countries granted reprieve to pregnant women sentenced to die, England's law offered no true mercy. It was not compassion that stayed the hand of the executioner when a condemned woman carried a child. It was merely procedure, a pause in cruelty, not a reprieve. The unborn life inside her was not a shield, only a postponement. Once the baby was delivered, the rope awaited, patient and indifferent to any plea. To understand this harshness, you must step into the 16th and 17th centuries, when England's justice system regarded women's bodies as both vessels and property. A woman convicted of a capital crime, witchcraft, theft, treason, or infanticide, might stand in court with her belly already swelling. The law called her plea the pleading the belly, and it was no act of desperation. It was a final bid to buy weeks, perhaps months, of life. The court would not trust the woman's word alone. A jury of matrons, local women summoned to examine her, would be appointed. Their task was to determine whether she was quick with child, meaning that the baby had begun to move within her womb. They would gather around the prisoner in a cold cell or the corner of a courthouse, feeling her abdomen, discussing her symptoms, her color, and whether her story rang true. If the matrons believed she carried a living child, the court issued a stay of execution. But this delay was never meant as an act of humanity. The law merely sought to avoid destroying property that did not yet belong to the condemned. The unborn infant was considered innocent, and was entitled to be born before its mother was hanged. Once the birth occurred, the sentence resumed without ceremony. There were no additional appeals, no reflection on whether a woman who had just suffered labor deserved any compassion. She might be permitted a few days to recover her strength, but soon the sheriff's men would come. In many recorded cases, the mother was led from the childbirth bed to the gallows, her body still weak, her child taken from her arms as she mounted the scaffold. This grim practice reflected England's broader view of crime and punishment. The body of the criminal was a site of retribution, a theater for demonstrating the power of the law. The pregnant woman's condition was not a mitigating factor. It was simply an inconvenience, an obstacle to be managed before justice could proceed. In some places, public interest was morbidly high. Crowds would gather to watch the trial, the birth, and the final execution. Broadsheets reported every detail: how the woman wept or held silent, how the child was carried away, how the crowd hushed as the noose was fixed around her neck. For all the talk of Christian morality, the punishment of pregnant women reveals a system more concerned with property and order than redemption. The tragedy of these stories is compounded by how easily they were forgotten. Once the sentence was carried out, the woman's name might fade, her child absorbed into the parish or left to struggle without kin. In the archives of assize courts and parish records, you can still find entries listing the cause of death simply as hanged, with no mention that the woman had given birth days before. The record was clinical, detached, and final. Yet among these entries you see glimpses of humanity: a midwife's note that the prisoner wept over her newborn, a parish clerk who recorded the baby's christening before the mother was led away. Such fragments remind us that beneath the brutal machinery of the law were real lives torn apart. Over time, legal reforms slowly tempered England's appetite for spectacle and harsh retribution. But the practice of delaying executions until after childbirth endured well into the 19th century. Even as Enlightenment ideals took hold, the principle remained: the life of the child mattered only until it entered the world. Then the mother's fate resumed its cold course. When we reflect on this history, it challenges us to question how far we have truly come. What does it say about a society that could hold a woman in the agony of childbirth only to extinguish her life once her child's breath was secured? It speaks to a time when justice was imagined as a blunt instrument, when the law claimed the right to every heartbeat, every moment of suffering. Today, these stories serve as a warning. They remind us that the machinery of punishment, if left unchecked by compassion, can become an engine of cruelty. It is easy to look back and feel certain we would have spoken out, would have questioned the sentence, would have insisted that a mother deserved more than a few borrowed weeks. But history suggests otherwise. The silence that followed these executions was as heavy as the gallows beam itself. And so the image endures. A woman condemned, her child delivered into a world that would never know her, her body given to the noose as though the miracle of life she carried had never mattered. It is a truth that stains the record of English justice and compels us to remember those whose last days were counted not by hope, but by the slow, relentless measure of the rope. Women were executed for knowing too much about herbs. In the medieval and early modern world, knowledge was often a dangerous inheritance, especially if you were a woman. Across Europe, in small villages tucked between dark forests and fields of rye, women held generations of secrets about plants, secrets that could heal fevers, ease childbirth, or soothe the dying. But in a time when the Church saw all power as either holy or heretical, this knowledge was a threat. And so countless midwives and herbalists were branded as witches, condemned for nothing more than knowing too much about the natural world. Imagine a woman crouched by the hearth, crushing dried leaves into a poultice. To her neighbors, she was a healer. But to the authorities, she was a sorceress working against God's will. As witchcraft trials spread like wildfire, the line between medicine and magic vanished. Any woman who could name a dozen plants or prepare a tincture for pain became a suspect. In Germany, trials in the 16th century show entire communities testifying that midwives caused miscarriages or cursed healthy babies simply by touching them. It didn't matter that most of their work was desperately needed. When epidemics struck, healers were the first to be called, but when fear returned, those same hands were accused of spreading plague through devilish rites. The Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious witch-hunting manual, singled out midwives as especially dangerous. The text claimed they had special power to kill infants, to steal souls, to serve Satan by ending life as well as bringing it forth. In many trials, all it took was a failed birth or a sickness no one could explain. Suddenly, herbs hanging by the window were proof of witchcraft. A mortar and pestle became instruments of diabolical craft. Even the knowledge of when to gather plants, at dawn, under certain moons, was twisted into evidence. In Essex, England, healers like Agnes Waterhouse were executed after neighbors claimed their remedies caused death. In France, Jeanne Arvilliers was burned for curing ailments with roots and prayers. She was accused of poisoning cattle and blighting crops, even though her remedies had once saved lives. Their stories were not unique. From Italy to Scotland, thousands met the same fate. Their skills, passed down through generations of women, became their undoing. Church courts and secular magistrates worked together, convinced that any woman who knew more than a priest must be consorting with the devil. Often the trials followed a predictable script. The accused was dragged from her home, locked away without food or sleep. She was threatened, sometimes tortured, until she confessed to impossible crimes. Flying at night, summoning storms, transforming herbs into curses. In confession, many described meeting demons who taught them to twist nature to evil ends, but these were confessions shaped by agony and terror, not truth. When sentence came, there was no mercy. A healer's execution served as a warning. Women learned to hide their knowledge, to burn their herbals, to pretend they knew nothing. The cost of speaking openly about plants and their properties was too high. Even after the trials subsided, suspicion lingered. The memory of flames and broken bodies haunted villages for generations. Some healers vanished from records, erased by fear. Others lived in silence, their wisdom dying with them. Today, we see these women differently. We recognize them as early scientists, as protectors of community health. But in their own time, they were hunted precisely because they stood at the threshold between life and death, holding knowledge that priests could not control. Their story is a reminder that ignorance and fear can destroy what is most valuable: the courage to heal, to learn, to pass wisdom forward. In the end, their only crime was knowing too much about the earth beneath their feet. The testimony of a single gossip could be a death sentence. The world did not always need evidence to destroy a life. Sometimes it needed only a whisper. A single voice carried through the walls of a thatched house. A single accusation, born not from truth, but from envy, resentment, or fear. In a society primed to see the devil's hand in every misfortune, even the smallest rumor could ignite a fire that no one could extinguish. And so it was that entire communities learned to watch their words, to measure every glance, to bury every private feud, because to be named a witch was not just to be accused of crime. It was to be condemned by suspicion itself. Imagine you are a woman in a small 17th century village, perhaps in England or the German states or colonial New England. You have no wealth to protect you, no powerful family to shield you, no voice that carries weight in the council hall. You survive on your own wits and the grudging respect of neighbors who depend on your work but secretly resent your independence. One day, a cow falls sick, or a child dies suddenly in the night, or a storm flattens a field of rye. And in that moment of loss, someone remembers the argument you had last year over a boundary fence. Someone remembers how you cursed under your breath when they raised their voice. Someone remembers that you looked at them a little too long, a little too coldly, and walked away without apology. The seed is planted. It grows in the fertile soil of fear. And when the time comes, when the magistrate comes asking questions, a neighbor steps forward. She lifts her chin, steadies her voice, and says she has always suspected there was something unnatural about you. That is all it takes. No proof, no witnesses, no pattern of crime. Only the testimony of a single gossip, someone who might have been your friend once, someone whose word carries no more weight than yours until suspicion tips the balance. Under the laws of many regions, a credible accusation was enough to warrant inquiry. And an inquiry, once begun, had a life of its own. Officials called it due process. But to the accused, it was a machine that ground up everything you were and left nothing but guilt behind. The first step was questioning. It might begin politely, with the constable asking you to explain yourself. But soon the tone would darken. They would ask why the neighbor claimed to have seen you muttering incantations, why you were present the day the cow died, why you had no husband or children to vouch for you. They would demand you name your accomplices, list your sins, describe your meetings with the devil. If you protested your innocence too loudly, it was proof you had rehearsed your denials. If you grew silent, it was proof you were hiding something. Every reaction was twisted into evidence. Every tremor in your voice confirmed there were suspicions. Once the investigation began, it rarely stopped. Other neighbors were called to testify, and here the contagion of accusation spread like disease. People who once nodded politely when you passed now came forward to remember every small slight, every petty grievance. They claimed you ruined their butter, or spoiled their ale, or sent nightmares to their children. These were things no court could disprove. How could you defend yourself against a dream? Against an accusation that your glance had withered crops or soured milk? In some villages, it took only one respected person to say, "I always thought she was strange," and the entire community began to agree. It was as though fear had a voice of its own, echoing from house to house until no one dared contradict it. The authorities, desperate to be seen as vigilant against witchcraft, welcomed such testimonies. In many jurisdictions, the law allowed for arrest and examination based on a single sworn statement. The concept of spectral evidence, the claim that your spirit had been seen tormenting the innocent, was accepted as fact. The Puritan judges in Salem relied heavily on such testimony. So did many European courts. Once your name was spoken, it became almost impossible to wash it clean. And then came the formal hearings. You would be led into a chamber, surrounded by men who believed they were righteous. They would read the accusations aloud. The neighbor who first named you might stand a few feet away, her voice steady as she repeated her claims. Perhaps she believed them. Perhaps she simply wanted to rid herself of a rival or distract suspicion from her own misfortunes. You would watch her face and see no mercy there. She had spoken the words that branded you, and now she would not unsay them. If you denied everything, it meant nothing. If you cried out in despair, it meant you were trying to bewitch the court with pity. If you collapsed from terror, it meant the devil was abandoning you. The only way to save your life was often to confess, to admit to crimes you never committed, to name others, to validate the machinery of fear. Some broke under the strain, weaving elaborate confessions in hopes of a gentler punishment. Some clung to innocence until the end. But in either case, the accusation itself had already done its work. Reputation, family, livelihood, gone. All because one voice decided you were guilty. It is easy to imagine that these things happened in isolated communities in ignorant times. But the truth is more unsettling. The witch hunts flourished precisely because they offered a simple explanation for complex tragedies. When crops failed or plagues spread or children died, people needed an enemy they could see, blame, and punish. The testimony of a gossip gave them that enemy. It was easier than admitting that the world was chaotic, that misfortune could come to anyone, that life was uncertain and often cruel without cause. To accuse someone else was to feel, for a moment, safe. Today, when we read these histories, we wonder how entire communities could be so blind. But the same impulses still exist. This hunger to find someone to blame, this thrill of moral certainty, this fear that makes us believe the worst about our neighbors. The gossip that began as a whisper could end as a death sentence, and no one was immune. Even the accuser sometimes became the accused, caught in the spiral of suspicion that spared no one. So we remember these stories not only as cautionary tales, but as mirrors. They show us how fragile justice can be when truth is measured by rumor, when fear passes for evidence, when a single voice can drown out reason. They remind us that the machinery of accusation is never fully gone. It only sleeps, waiting for the next time a frightened society looks for someone to blame. This is the legacy of the witch hunts. Not just the flames and the gallows, but the quiet, deadly power of a single whisper, spoken in anger or envy, that destroyed lives in the name of righteousness. And it is a reminder that the greatest dangers are not always loud. Sometimes they begin with nothing more than a neighbor leaning in close, lowering her voice, and saying, "I have always suspected there was something wrong with her." Daughters were pressured to spy on their own mothers. In a time when darkness and fear walked hand in hand through the villages of Europe, when suspicion was the strongest law and rumor the sharpest weapon, even the sacred bond between mother and child was no protection. Imagine a small cottage, its thatched roof black against the sky. Inside, a mother tends the fire while her daughter sits silently, eyes lowered, knowing that every word she hears, every movement she sees, could be used against the woman who gave her life. This was not a story from legend. It was a grim reality repeated in countless towns during the witch hunts that swept through Europe from the 15th to the 17th centuries. Families were ordered to watch one another, and no relationship, however close, was safe. The authorities believed that evil left traces everywhere. They taught that a witch could not hide her nature, not even from her own children. Ministers and magistrates instructed communities that loyalty to God and King came before loyalty to family. Daughters were pressured to betray their mothers under threat of punishment, public shame, or exile. In some cases, young girls were told that their own souls were in danger if they did not speak up. They were questioned alone, away from their families, surrounded by stern men who promised safety if they only confessed what they had seen. Dreams, gestures, old scars. Nothing was too small to become evidence. A mother who muttered to herself while spinning wool, who prayed at odd hours, who sighed in her sleep, could be accused of unholy deeds. And if a daughter admitted she had witnessed any sign, it could seal her mother's fate. One of the most chilling aspects of this history is how ordinary the betrayals began. A daughter might speak of a strange mark on her mother's shoulder, something she had seen 100 times and never questioned. Under pressure, she might recall hearing her mother whisper prayers she did not understand. She might remember being ill and seeing her mother make herbal remedies. Each detail, harmless on its own, became part of a deadly puzzle. Officials wrote everything down, building cases that could end in torture or execution. Consider the case of the Pendle witch trials in England. There, in 1612, a young girl named Janet Device was brought to testify against her mother, Elizabeth. Barely 9 years old, Janet stood in the courtroom and described gatherings she claimed to have seen. Her small voice carried more weight than any protest, because the law at that time allowed children to give evidence in witchcraft cases. Her words were enough. Elizabeth was found guilty and hanged. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded. Children confessing under fear, repeating stories taught to them by adults eager to root out evil. The damage was not confined to the accused. Daughters who betrayed their mothers often lived with the guilt forever. Some grew up believing they had saved their communities. Others realized too late that they had been used as tools of terror. The bond between mother and child, already fragile in hard times, was twisted beyond recognition. Neighbors watched closely, eager to see which child would become the next witness. Communities fell apart, trust dissolved, and a climate of suspicion consumed everything. Even the innocent were never truly safe. Why did authorities target children in this way? Partly it was strategy. They knew a child's word could be more persuasive than any adult accusation. If a daughter spoke of witchcraft in her own home, it suggested no secret was safe. but it was also about control. When families were forced to turn against themselves, resistance collapsed. Parents who knew their children might betray them grew fearful, careful, silent. No whisper of doubt, no private prayer could be shared. The witch hunts were not only about punishing individuals, they were about destroying the bonds that held communities together. It is easy, centuries later, to wonder how so many people could believe such stories. But in a world where disease, famine, and death were constant companions, the need to find an explanation was overwhelming. People believed witches caused misfortune because it gave them something to fight. In that desperate struggle for order, no sacrifice was too great, not even the sacrifice of a child's love. The records left behind, testimonies scrawled in ink, sentences handed down by judges, still carry the echo of voices too young to understand the consequences of their words. This is why we remember. Not to condemn those children, but to honor the mothers who faced their final hours with courage, knowing they had been condemned by the very hands they once held in love. Their stories warn us how easily fear can poison the purest relationships. They remind us that true justice must never be built on the betrayal of innocence. And they teach that even in the darkest chapters of history, the truth has a way of surviving, carried in the quiet memories of those who lived it. Once accused, you couldn't prove you were innocent. Imagine waking before dawn to the heavy knock of the constable's fist on your door. The cold air rushes inside as a crowd gathers behind him. Neighbors, the magistrate, the parish clerk, all staring with a mixture of curiosity and dread. They are here because someone has spoken your name in accusation. Someone has said you are a witch. You try to protest, but already you can see in their eyes that no explanation will matter. From the moment you are accused, the outcome has been decided. There will be no exoneration, no absolution, no safe return to the life you knew. You are caught in a system designed so you cannot escape. This was not an accident. For centuries, witch trials across Europe and colonial America were constructed to make defense impossible. The logic was cruel but effective. To deny the charge was to provoke more suspicion. After all, why would you deny it so forcefully unless you were trying to hide your guilt? And to confess was to seal your own doom, since confession was considered proof of the crime. Either path led only to suffering and death. Authorities believed that witches were clever, deceitful, and skilled in masking their allegiance to Satan. Therefore, any attempt to maintain innocence was treated as a sign of duplicity. Even your silence was suspect. The more you pleaded, the deeper you sank into suspicion. This was the fatal paradox at the heart of the witch craze. The accused could never be innocent, because innocence itself was a trick of the devil. Once you were named, you would be taken to a cell, stripped of dignity, and interrogated by men who believed they were saving your soul and the souls of your neighbors. They examined your body for witches' marks, birthmarks, scars, moles, any imperfection that could be called the devil's seal. A freckle on your shoulder could be cited as evidence that you had suckled a familiar spirit. The mere existence of such marks meant that you had already been judged before you spoke a word. The confessions that followed were rarely voluntary. Sleep deprivation was a common tactic. You would be kept awake for days, questioned constantly, until your mind fractured and you began to say what your captors wanted to hear. Food was withheld, light was denied. You were left in filth and darkness. Under such conditions, any human being would break. And when you did, your words were transcribed, signed, and presented to the court as proof that you had, indeed, made a pact with the devil. Even then, your suffering was not finished. You were expected to name others. Authorities demanded that you reveal accomplices and describe secret gatherings. Every additional name you offered was another link in a chain of accusation that pulled more neighbors into the same inescapable snare. In some cases, entire families were destroyed by a single confession, each forced to accuse the others in a desperate attempt to bargain for mercy that never came. The trials themselves were a grotesque performance of predetermined guilt. Hearsay was admissible. Gossip was considered testimony. If a neighbor said they saw a black cat near your doorstep or heard you muttering after a quarrel, that was treated as meaningful evidence. The absence of proof did not help you. On the contrary, it was often seen as confirmation that the devil was shielding you from discovery. This warped logic meant that nothing you said or did could free you. You were condemned by the very fact that you had been accused. In many cases, the methods of testing your innocence were designed to prove guilt by any means necessary. One of the most notorious was the swimming test. Bound hand and foot, you were thrown into a river. If you floated, it was evidence that you had rejected baptism and were buoyed by demonic power. If you sank, you were declared innocent, but often drowned before anyone could pull you free. The test was not a trial. It was a ritual humiliation and a near-certain death sentence. The legal system itself was stacked against you. Judges and magistrates were often under pressure to show that they were vigilant in protecting their communities from witchcraft. The social and religious climate demanded visible action, and so they pressed forward with prosecutions fueled by public hysteria and the comforting belief that executing the accused would restore order and divine favor. There are countless stories of individuals caught in this trap, their lives erased by accusations they could never disprove. In England, Elizabeth Clark, an elderly disabled woman, was accused by Matthew Hopkins, the infamous witch-finder general. Hopkins's interrogations led to confessions extracted under unimaginable duress, and ultimately to Clark's death. In Salem, Massachusetts, Sarah Good maintained her innocence to the last breath, yet her denials only deepened suspicion. She was hanged alongside other women whose only crime was being vulnerable in a society that demanded scapegoats. The most insidious part of this process was how it corrupted entire communities. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families were torn apart, and the bonds of trust that held villages together dissolved in an atmosphere of fear. Once an accusation began, it spread like fire through dry grass, consuming reputations, friendships, and the fragile sense of safety that was all most people possessed. Even after execution, the taint of witchcraft did not vanish. Families of the condemned were shunned. Property was seized. Children carried the burden of their parents' supposed sins. The stain was permanent. It lived on in parish records, in the whispered stories of neighbors, in the nightmares of survivors who had watched helplessly as justice became a twisted parody. Centuries later, it is easy to look back and wonder how such madness could have taken hold. But the truth is that the witch trials did not arise from ignorance alone. They came from fear of disease, famine, war, and the unknowable forces that shaped people's lives. They came from the desire to control what could not be controlled, to make sense of suffering by assigning blame. They came from the human tendency to believe that if someone must be guilty, it cannot be us. And so the machinery of accusation ground on year after year, leaving behind only sorrow and shame. The lesson it offers is both clear and unsettling. When fear becomes more powerful than reason, when communities choose to see enemies instead of neighbors, and when the law is shaped to ensure guilt rather than discover truth, no one is safe. In that world, innocence was not a defense. Once accused, you were already condemned. And even as the noose tightened or the pyre was lit, many died still, proclaiming the truth that no one was willing to hear, that they were innocent, and that nothing they could have said or done would ever have made a difference. Torture tools were hidden behind legal loopholes. In the cold chambers of English justice, where stone walls held the cries of the accused, torture was officially banned by law. The statutes proclaimed England as a realm of enlightened fairness, where no confession would be wrenched from a man or woman by the rack or iron. But this promise was, in truth, only a veneer. Behind it lay a dark reality, a network of unofficial torment, perfected through legal loopholes and quiet complicity. While the official doctrine declared torture unlawful, the methods devised to break the spirit without breaking the law were no less cruel. To understand how this contradiction flourished, you must step into the mindset of early modern England, a time obsessed with order, conformity, and religious orthodoxy. Confessions were prized as the crown of evidence, the final proof of guilt, the justification for the gallows or the stake. When a suspect would not confess freely, officials simply found subtler ways to compel them. Sleep deprivation became one of the most insidious weapons. It was never called torture. It was simply a matter of keeping the accused awake under questioning. Guards were instructed to rouse prisoners whenever their eyes closed. Hours blended into days, reason dissolved, and the mind grew raw until many would say anything to end the ordeal. Another favored practice was forced crouching. The prisoner would be made to squat in the same position for endless hours, sometimes with heavy weights placed upon the shoulders. Though no blade pierced the flesh, the muscles burned, the joints stiffened, and the body trembled under the strain. If the prisoner collapsed, guards would drag them upright again. This punishment left no marks that a physician might later declare evidence of unlawful torture. Then there was isolation, the most silent cruelty of all. Prisoners were locked alone in small, damp cells, denied contact with any other living soul. The mind starved for sound, for reassurance, for any sign that the world beyond still existed. Days of isolation could unravel even the strongest resolve, sowing terror and despair deeper than any wound. Officials justified these practices with careful language. They argued that since the accused were not physically maimed, the methods were merely restraints, not torture. Records from the time are filled with this polite deceit. Judges wrote of prisoners being examined with diligence or kept under watchful observation. Behind those phrases were countless hours of torment, sleepless nights, agonizing cramps, whispered threats that the suffering would never end. In witchcraft cases, these tactics took on a particularly sinister character. A woman accused of consorting with demons could be subjected to sleep deprivation until she babbled any confession her interrogators desired. If she denied guilt, forced crouching would follow, sometimes combined with starvation or endless prayer sessions designed to break her will. All of it was cloaked in the righteous language of spiritual purification, yet it was nothing but psychological torture. The public rarely saw these hidden cruelties. In court, the accused might appear haggard and trembling, but no visible wounds betrayed the ordeal. Officials were careful to keep up appearances, insisting the law had been honored. But private letters and diaries hint at the truth. Clergymen recorded the vacant stares of prisoners too exhausted to speak. Jailers admitted in hushed tones that many confessed only after days without sleep or contact. The line between lawful interrogation and outright torture was so thin it might as well not have existed. Yet these methods were rarely questioned. Most people believed that any means were justified to protect society from traitors, heretics, or witches. The few who dared protest found themselves accused of sympathizing with the enemy. Over time, England's legal scholars began to acknowledge the hypocrisy. The polite fictions that shielded these practices began to crumble as Enlightenment ideals took hold. But the process was slow. Well into the 18th century, courts continued to exploit loopholes, using deprivation and isolation to bend prisoners to their will. Even as public executions dwindled and legal reforms advanced, the machinery of hidden torture lingered in the shadows. Today, this legacy remains a cautionary tale. It reveals how easily a society can congratulate itself for banning cruelty while secretly tolerating it in new forms. It shows how language can be twisted to excuse inhumanity, how law can be used as a mask to hide the true face of power. The story of England's unofficial tortures challenges us to look honestly at the systems we inherit, to ask whether our own institutions, too, contain quiet spaces where suffering is inflicted in the name of justice behind closed doors and careful words. It reminds us that the difference between law and cruelty is not always as clear as we wish to believe. And so, when we hear old records declaring that England was a land without torture, we must remember the silent cells, the sleepless nights, the unseen agonies. We must remember the voices that cracked in the darkness, confessing to crimes they may never have committed, all because the law declared it was not torture if the scars were hidden. Witches were hanged in public as spectacles. In the centuries when Europe trembled under the weight of superstition and fear, there emerged a spectacle that turned death itself into a form of public entertainment. The hanging of accused witches was not merely an act of punishment or purification. It was a carefully staged performance that drew entire towns into its grim theater. As dawn broke across cobblestone squares and church bells tolled ominous notes, men, women, and even children gathered in eager anticipation. For many, the execution of a so-called witch was the most exciting event they would witness in their lifetimes. Imagine the scene: a wooden scaffold rising stark against the sky, ropes prepared with brutal efficiency, and the accused, sometimes trembling, sometimes defiant, led through the jeering crowds. All around, vendors set up stalls to sell pies, bread, and ale. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the stench of fear. To the authorities, these executions served two purposes. They were intended as a warning: stray too far from the church, speak too openly, practice anything that looked like folk healing, and you might find yourself at the end of a rope. But they were also spectacles designed to unite communities through shared hostility. Watching a woman die became perversely a way to reinforce the bonds of conformity. The audience was told that they were witnessing the triumph of God over the devil, the cleansing of evil from their midst. And yet, beneath the prayers and solemn pronouncements lay a carnival atmosphere. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, straining for a better view. Merchants hawked cheap trinkets, charms to protect against witches' curses. Some spectators claimed that they could see demons rising from the condemned, proof that justice was being done. In the German states and in England alike, chroniclers noted that crowds could swell into the thousands. The more notorious the accused, the larger the gathering. If a midwife or healer was said to have killed children or spoiled crops, the spectacle became even more lurid. People traveled for miles to watch her last moments. They came not merely to see her punished, but to reassure themselves that evil had a face, and that face was not theirs. The condemned were sometimes allowed a final word. Some confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the night, dancing with devils, summoning storms. Others maintained their innocence until the rope was tightened. But their words were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd, the laughter of children, the vendors shouting over each other for attention. In some cases, musicians played as the trapdoor fell open. Drums and pipes attempted to mask the sound of death. Officials declared that the executions were necessary to keep the devil at bay, but they could not disguise the truth. These hangings were a form of collective release, a dark ritual that allowed ordinary people to purge their fears by projecting them onto a single victim. Once the body swung lifeless, the mood often shifted. Some spectators made the sign of the cross and hurried home, suddenly aware that they had witnessed a human life extinguished. Others lingered, discussing every detail: the color of the victim's dress, the expression on her face, the final gasp. Even in death, the condemned were denied peace. In many towns, their bodies were left hanging for hours as a warning. Crows gathered on rooftops waiting to scavenge. Children were dared to run up and touch the hem of a dead woman's skirt. Local officials sometimes charged relatives a fee to remove and bury the remains. And if the family could not pay, the body might be buried at a crossroads without ceremony. In places like Bury St. Edmunds in Lancaster, detailed records show how these events were organized almost like festivals. Authorities arranged transport for prisoners and coordinated guards to keep the crowd orderly. At the same time, taverns stocked extra ale, knowing that the execution would draw patrons from every corner of the county. It is difficult to comprehend how a community could turn such cruelty into a form of amusement. But fear is a powerful engine, and in the witch hunts, fear was deliberately stoked by those in power. The church, local magistrates, and self-appointed witch-finders all profited, whether through money, influence, or notoriety. Public hangings served their purposes perfectly. They created an enemy everyone could despise, a scapegoat everyone could blame. They made complex problems, famine, plague, social unrest, seem simpler by pointing to a single cause, the witch. And so, the crowds kept coming, year after year, generation after generation, convinced that watching a woman die would somehow protect them from the darkness. Even centuries later, the records leave no doubt that these spectacles left scars. They taught people to distrust their neighbors, to silence their doubts, to find relief in the suffering of others. Those who watched learned a lesson that would echo long after the gallows were dismantled, that in a world ruled by fear, no one was truly safe. Today, when we look back on these scenes, it is tempting to imagine that we are too civilized to repeat such horrors. But the truth is that whenever we allow fear and superstition to overrule compassion, we inch closer to that scaffold. Whenever we are tempted to make entertainment out of someone else's pain, we stand among those jeering crowds. The memory of these hangings demands that we remember the humanity of every person, even the accused. Because once we forget that, the spectacle can begin again, only with new victims and new excuses for cruelty. In the end, these public executions were not about justice. They were about power, fear, and the terrifying ease with which a crowd can be convinced that killing is not only necessary, but entertaining. That is their most haunting legacy. A legacy we must never allow to return. Local clergy used witch trials to boost their power. The church bell tolls in the cold morning, calling the village to gather beneath the steeple. Inside, the air smells of damp wool, of earth tracked in on tired boots, of fear. At the pulpit stands the priest, draped in black, his voice echoing through the nave. He is speaking of sin, of corruption, of hidden pacts with the devil. He says that wickedness is a weed growing in secret among them, and that God demands it be pulled up by the roots. Every eye turns to the floor. No one dares meet the gaze of their neighbors, because everyone knows when a man of God declares evil has come among them, it is only a matter of time before he names the face it wears. This is not the stuff of legend. This is history. An era when the pulpit became the launching pad of accusation, and when the very men sworn to offer comfort and salvation used their influence to condemn. In early modern Europe and the American colonies, witch trials were never just the product of frightened peasants or overzealous magistrates. They were often fanned into roaring flames by the clergy themselves, and their motives were not always holy. For some priests and ministers, the hunt for witches was an opportunity, a chance to showcase their righteousness, to rally the people under their authority, and to tighten their grip on a frightened flock. In communities where the church was the center of life, the word of a priest carried the weight of divine law. When he thundered from the pulpit that Satan had come among them, few dared to question him. To doubt the priest was to doubt God. So the accusations began, not in courts, but in sermons where suspicion was dressed in Scripture. The priest would warn that heresy was spreading, that women in league with the devil were poisoning wells, blighting fields, and stealing children in the night. And with every sermon, the tension grew. Neighbors began to watch each other, to wonder which of them was hiding the devil's mark. In the anxious hush after the service, names would be whispered, and those whispers soon became formal charges. Once the machinery of accusation began to turn, it never paused to ask why. Perhaps the woman accused had spoken out against the priest's authority. Perhaps she had questioned his sermons or refused to donate more than she could afford. Perhaps she was simply different, too poor, too proud, too learned. The priest needed only to suggest that her piety was lacking, and the seed of doubt would bloom. It was an easy thing to do, because everyone wanted reassurance that God was watching, that evil could be rooted out, that disaster had a cause, and that the cause could be punished. Historians have documented how the clergy's role in witch trials was often driven by a hunger for influence as much as by spiritual zeal. In many regions, the crown demanded proof that local leaders were vigilant against heresy and witchcraft. A priest who presided over confessions and executions could point to his zeal as evidence of loyalty to the monarch. The more witches he discovered, the more his reputation as a defender of faith grew. In an age when power was measured by visibility, witch trials offered a stage upon which the clergy could perform their righteousness before both the people and the crown. Consider the sermons of Cotton Mather in colonial Massachusetts. Though not the sole architect of the Salem witch trials, his writings and public statements lent legitimacy to the hysteria. His authority reassured the courts that their actions were righteous. In Europe, ministers in Germany and Scotland wrote treatises explaining why torture and execution were necessary to protect Christendom. In their eyes, doubt was complicity. To question the trial was to side with the devil. This is how power protected itself, by branding skepticism as treachery. To the clergy, each confession extracted under starvation and sleeplessness, each cry of despair, each broken spirit was proof that their crusade was holy, and the community, desperate for guidance, often thanked them for it. In some towns, the priest's influence grew so strong that he became the de facto ruler. He decided whose faith was genuine. He decided whose life was spared. Those who praised him became safe. Those who resisted or who simply could not pay the tithes he demanded soon found themselves accused. It is important to remember that not every priest participated in these horrors. Some spoke out against the trials, warning that fear and superstition had replaced reason. But these voices were often drowned out by the louder chorus of clergy who saw witch hunts as an instrument of both spiritual purification and personal power. They quoted scripture to justify cruelty. They framed the trials as a defense of the community. They insisted that to show mercy was to invite the devil's return. For the women caught in this web, there was no escape. A single sermon could mark them for life. A single nod from the pulpit could convince their neighbors that they were consorts of hell. Once suspicion took hold, the rituals began. The stripping, the searching, the pricking, the sleepless nights. And through it all, the priest's authority hung over them like a noose. Even if they survived, their names were ruined, their families were tainted, their children grew up under the shadow of a crime that had never been committed. In the end, these trials did not purify faith. They corrupted it. They turned the church, the very place where people had sought comfort, into a courtroom where no defense was allowed. They taught communities that mercy was weakness, that suspicion was virtue, that the measure of piety was how quickly one could condemn a neighbor. And all the while, the clergy's power grew stronger, rooted in the fear they had cultivated. When we look back, we must see this history for what it is, a cautionary tale about how spiritual authority, when unchecked, can become a weapon more dangerous than any sword. The witch trials remind us that the loudest cries of righteousness often conceal the hungriest thirst for control. That when leaders use faith to justify violence, the innocent will always pay the price. Today, the stones of those old churches still stand. Some of them have been repurposed or abandoned, their pews empty. But if you walk their aisles and listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes. The sermons that named women as witches, the prayers twisted into curses, the voices of the accused pleading for their lives. And you can feel the heavy truth that the most dangerous lies are those spoken with the certainty of holiness. This is the legacy of the clergy's witch hunts, a legacy of fear masquerading as faith, of ambition cloaked in righteousness, and of countless lives destroyed so that a few men could claim they were closer to God. Natural disasters were blamed on witches in every town. When thunder rolled across the rooftops of medieval villages, when lightning split the night sky, when floods rose and fields drowned beneath murky water, the people who huddled in candlelit rooms believed these terrors were not accidents of nature. They believed someone had called them down, that hidden among them were witches whose dark powers could bend the weather itself. In a world without science to explain the fury of the earth, superstition became the only refuge and the only weapon. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, entire communities turned their eyes on the women in their midst, searching for someone to blame. A sudden storm could become a death sentence. A failed harvest might condemn a dozen souls. This was not a single region's madness. It spread across Europe, England, Germany, France, the Low Countries, and no town was untouched by suspicion. Authorities and clergy taught that witches made pacts with the devil, that he gifted them powers over the winds, rains, and flames. Sermons warned that witches could stir tempests by boiling water in iron pots, that they could whisper curses into the night air, sending hail to destroy crops and disease to ruin herds. These beliefs were so widespread that legal codes included weather magic as evidence of witchcraft. If lightning struck a church steeple, if fire leapt from one house to the next, if a river overflowed, it was proof that witches were near. The accusation needed no real evidence. All it took was fear, sharpened by loss and desperation. When lives were fragile and every season a test of survival, people could not accept that disaster was random. They needed a human cause, someone to punish, someone to remove so the world might feel safe again. The victims were often the most vulnerable: older women who lived alone, healers who gathered herbs, widows whose independence marked them as suspicious. But sometimes suspicion swallowed entire families or groups of neighbors. When floods consumed villages, the survivors would gather in the square, their grief twisting into anger. Who had cursed the river? Who had called down the rain? In many cases, the accused were interrogated for days. Torture was common. Under agony, they would confess to anything their accusers demanded. They described imaginary Sabbaths, described raising storms with incantations they did not know until the questions taught them. These confessions were copied into records as proof that witches were real, that their power was the true cause of every calamity. One of the most notorious examples came in the German lands, where entire towns were swept into witch hunts after years of terrible weather. From 1560 to 1630, relentless rains and bitter cold ruined harvest after harvest. Famine and plague followed. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg, hundreds were executed. Chroniclers wrote that storms seemed to follow certain women, that lightning struck wherever they walked. Of course, none of it was true, but to desperate villagers, the accusations offered a sense of control. If witches were behind the disasters, then killing them would bring relief. And so the gallows and pyres were built. In Scotland, too, weather was central to witchcraft trials. The North Berwick witches were accused in 1590 of raising a storm to sink the ship of King James VI. Their confessions, extracted under torture, described gatherings where the devil commanded them to conjure winds. These stories were printed in pamphlets and spread across the kingdom, stoking new fear wherever they were read. Soon any storm was suspect. A lightning strike was never an accident. A house fire was never misfortune. And the price for these beliefs was always paid in blood. What makes these histories so haunting is how ordinary people embraced them. Neighbors who once shared harvests turned against each other. Ministers who preached charity became instruments of terror. The fear was infectious. It moved faster than any flood, consuming reason and compassion. Those who spoke in defense of the accused were themselves accused. Silence became the only safety, and even that was no guarantee. With time, scientific understanding slowly replaced superstition. The study of weather, the rise of Enlightenment thinking, and the questioning of religious authority all weakened the old beliefs. But it took generations for the tide to turn. Even as late as the 18th century, records show accusations of storm raising and fire calling. And always the accused were powerless to prove their innocence. Remember the faces behind these stories. Each woman dragged from her home in the rain. Each family shattered because a storm demanded a victim. The tragedies were not random. They were created by fear, by ignorance, by the human need to find blame when nature reminded us of our helplessness. These histories remain a warning. When disaster comes, we must resist the temptation to seek scapegoats. Because in every age, when fear outweighs reason, innocence is the first casualty. Trials continued. Even after the law changed, picture a world where a new law is passed, promising relief, a measure of sanity after years of terror. Imagine the proclamations nailed to church doors declaring that witchcraft prosecutions will be restrained, that the cruelest methods will no longer be tolerated. For a moment, people breathe easier. They tell themselves the nightmare is ending. But in countless villages and hidden corners, nothing changes. The fear that had been stoked for generations does not vanish with the stroke of a magistrate's pen. Instead, it burrows deeper, becoming a silent contagion. The law may have softened, but the human instinct to hunt witches proved harder to uproot. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1604 imposed harsh penalties, including death, for anyone convicted of practicing witchcraft. Decades later, in 1735, the law was reformed. The death penalty was abolished, and witchcraft itself was officially declared a superstition. It was a remarkable admission, an acknowledgement that countless innocent people had perished under a legal system that had mistaken fear for evidence. The new law reduced witchcraft to a crime of fraud rather than a capital offense. But by then, the damage was already deep in the marrow of communities. Across Europe, similar reforms appeared. Rulers, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, began to see witch trials as relics of a darker age. Philosophers argued that superstition must be stamped out, that reason must replace hysteria. Some governments issued edicts forbidding torture, restricting the use of swimming tests and the grotesque search for witches' marks. On paper, it seemed the tide had turned, but the reality in many villages was very different. People had lived for generations under the conviction that witches were real, that Satan walked among them, and that the only way to protect their families was to identify and destroy those in league with him. The law could not erase the memories of crops failing, children dying, livestock sickening, disasters that had once demanded an explanation. Even as courts in London or Paris began to dismiss witchcraft charges, villagers clung to the rituals that had made sense of their suffering. Secret trials began to replace official ones. Instead of magistrates and clerks, it was local elders and self-appointed witch-finders who carried out the interrogations. People were still dragged from their homes at night, locked in barns or cellars, and subjected to the same accusations and humiliations that had once occurred under the banner of law. Sometimes the victims were beaten or starved until they confessed. Sometimes they were tied and thrown into ponds, watched by neighbors desperate to see guilt confirmed. Even as judges in distant cities declared the practice illegal, communities continued to kill in silence. In parts of Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, records reveal that unofficial witch trials persisted decades after formal prosecutions were banned. In Norway, secret burnings occurred into the 18th century. The last known execution for witchcraft in Europe happened in Switzerland in 1782, when Anna Goldie was beheaded, despite the growing consensus that witchcraft trials were barbaric. Even her death did not mark a true end, merely the last execution that authorities dared to record openly. What is most chilling is how these hidden persecutions often relied on the same familiar justifications. People insisted they were protecting their children, safeguarding their crops, upholding moral order. They told themselves that if the law would no longer act, then it was their sacred duty to step into its place. The same sermons that once inspired official prosecutions continued to echo from pulpits. Ministers warned that the devil was cunning, that he would exploit the laxness of modern courts to spread his influence. And so the old rituals continued. Accusation, interrogation, confession, punishment, only now in shadows, behind closed doors, beyond the reach of reform. The victims of these secret trials rarely appear in history books. Their names were not always recorded. Often they were poor women, widows, beggars, healers who had no family strong enough to protest their disappearance. In some villages, their deaths were concealed as accidents or suicides. In others, the community simply agreed never to speak of them again. The silence became its own kind of complicity. Even where executions were no longer carried out, social death could be just as devastating. Accused people were expelled from their homes, shunned by neighbors, left to wander the roads without shelter or sustenance. Their children were forced into begging. Their families changed their names to escape the stain of association. The slow violence of exile and starvation replaced the spectacle of the gallows, but the effect was the same. Lives erased because fear proved stronger than law. This persistence of persecution teaches us something profoundly unsettling about human nature. It shows that it is not enough to change laws or issue proclamations. When fear becomes a habit, when hatred is woven into the fabric of daily life, it survives every effort to uproot it. People find ways to continue what they believe is necessary, even when the world has moved on without them. They convince themselves that justice requires breaking the very laws designed to protect the innocent. In time, witch trials did truly end. Enlightenment thinking spread, literacy increased, and scientific explanations slowly displaced superstition. But the process was not clean or sudden. It was not a story of immediate enlightenment. It was a long, uneven struggle between old terror and new ideas. For every city that embraced reason, there were villages that clung to old rituals in secret, convinced that civilization's progress was simply proof that the devil was winning. Centuries later, the echoes of those hidden trials still linger. We see them in the way communities can turn inward, inventing enemies when times grow hard. We see them in the stories of scapegoats, those blamed for disease, disaster, or decline simply because they are different. The machinery of accusation never truly disappears. It merely waits for the next crisis to reactivate. When you stand in the ruins of a village where such things occurred, the silence feels different. It is not just the absence of voices, but the weight of all the things that were done behind closed doors, acts that no law could prevent, no proclamation could end, no reform could erase. It is the reminder that fear endures long after the gallows have rotted away, and that the hardest thing to banish is the certainty that someone else must be guilty. This is the legacy of those who died in secret. Their stories are warnings that the end of a law does not mean the end of persecution, that reform without understanding is fragile, and that true change requires not just new statutes, but a reckoning with the darkness inside us all. Confessing to witchcraft could save your life, then kill you. In the shadowed courtrooms and cold village squares of early modern England and Scotland, an accusation of witchcraft was not just a threat to your life. It was a trap without escape. Women accused of consorting with the devil were often promised mercy if they confessed. The judges and ministers spoke in solemn voices, assuring them that an honest admission would spare them the agony of the noose or the flames. But in truth, these promises were frequently nothing more than a cruel deception. Once a confession was secured, the machinery of execution rolled forward, unstoppable, its gears lubricated by the very words extracted through fear. To understand how such betrayal became routine, you must step into the mindset of the witch hunts. In the 16th and 17th centuries, belief in the devil's earthly agents was not a fringe superstition, but a consensus. Ministers preached that witches were the enemy within, servants of Satan who could ruin crops, blight livestock, or sicken children with a glance. Villages already strained by poverty and disease needed explanations for their suffering, and witchcraft offered a convenient target. When suspicion fell on a woman, often older, widowed, or simply different, her world collapsed. Dragged before magistrates, she faced an impossible choice: deny the charge and endure relentless questioning, sleep deprivation, or public humiliation. Confess and be told that in exchange for honesty, she might be spared execution and allowed to repent in prison or live in exile. Many women, their strength already shattered, chose to confess. In their minds, it was the only path that offered a sliver of hope. They recited stories of midnight sabbats, of pacts signed in blood, of spirits who came to suckle at hidden marks on their flesh. These confessions were sometimes detailed fantasies built under duress, fabrications woven from leading questions and the imagination's last resources. To the authorities, however, the confession was proof. It confirmed their worst suspicions, validated their authority, and justified the punishment to come. The promise of mercy evaporated. The confession that was supposed to save a life became the evidence that destroyed it. The betrayal was not always immediate. Some women were held for weeks, believing they would be spared. They were told to prepare their souls, to pray for forgiveness, to reflect on their sins. But one morning, the guards would appear at dawn, carrying ropes or chains, and the truth became undeniable. There would be no reprieve. The village would gather to witness the sentence. The condemned might be carried, too weak to walk, or led on foot past neighbors who dared not meet her eyes. In England, she was usually hanged. In Scotland, she was more often strangled and then burned, her body reduced to ash before the crowd dispersed. In these moments, the lie was complete. The promise that confession would save her had served its purpose. It had extracted a story that satisfied the court, quelled public anxiety, and reaffirmed the power of the law. For the victim, it was the final cruelty in a long chain of degradations. Some contemporaries recognized the moral cost of this duplicity. A few ministers and magistrates left behind letters expressing regret that confessions gained under such circumstances could not be trusted. But the tide of hysteria was too strong. In periods of intense witch hunting, even officials who harbored doubts dared not challenge the system. To do so risked suspicion of sympathy for witches, or worse, secret alliance with the devil. The betrayal of confessing women was not an accident. It was built into the process. By dangling the hope of survival, authorities encouraged prisoners to implicate themselves and often others, expanding the scope of the investigation. A single confession could trigger a cascade of fresh accusations as women, desperate to prove their sincerity, named neighbors and relatives as fellow conspirators. The machinery fed upon itself, and every new confession gave it momentum. Over time, as Enlightenment ideals began to challenge older beliefs, some voices condemned these false promises. Jurists and philosophers argued that a confession without free will was worthless, that extracting it with threats or deceit was a stain on justice. But by then, countless lives had already been lost, their stories reduced to terse entries in parish registers and trial records. Today, the image remains vivid. A woman kneeling in a drafty cell, clutching her skirts, whispering that she would say anything if only she might be allowed to live. Her confession is written down in careful script, signed with a trembling mark. Somewhere in the same record, the date of her execution is noted, the last page in a story that was never truly her own. This history challenges us to ask hard questions about the human cost of fear and the ease with which institutions can betray the vulnerable. It reminds us that promises made under duress are no promises at all. They are instruments of control, weapons disguised as kindness. And in remembering the countless women who confessed in hope and died in despair, we are compelled to recognize that the past is never entirely past. The machinery of accusation, deception, and punishment still lurks in many forms, ready to rise whenever fear eclipses compassion. Women with disabilities were the first to be accused. In the dark centuries, when superstition ruled every corner of life, when priests spoke of demons lurking behind every misfortune, there was a quiet, persistent terror reserved for those whose bodies or minds did not fit the narrow mold of what was considered normal. Women with disabilities, women whose limbs were twisted by birth, whose faces were scarred by illness, whose minds wandered into places others could not follow, were among the very first to be accused of witchcraft. Their crime was not malice, it was simply being different. To live with a visible disability in medieval and early modern Europe was to be marked twice over. First, by the trials of daily survival in societies that offered no mercy or support. Second, by the whispered certainty that such afflictions could only be signs of the devil's touch. Imagine a woman born with a hunched back or a withered leg, laboring each day to carry water or gather firewood, while children pointed and spat behind her. She could not hide her difference, and when livestock fell sick or storms destroyed a harvest, it was often her name that surfaced first. People needed someone to blame, and no one was easier to accuse than the woman whose body had already been judged as cursed. In the German principalities, records show that women with epilepsy or seizures were almost automatically suspected. A convulsion in the marketplace, A fall with foaming lips was not seen as illness, but as evidence that the devil had claimed her. In England, parish registers listed monstrous births as omens. The mothers of children born with deformities were branded as witches themselves, accused of consorting with dark powers to produce offspring marked by evil. In France, a woman named Perrette was dragged before the inquisitors because her skin bore strange blotches and her hands trembled. Neighbors testified that she could spoil butter and make cows dry simply by looking at them. No evidence was needed beyond her appearance. And so she was tortured until she confessed to impossible crimes. Some women suffered from mental illnesses that in any age would bring them confusion and fear. In that time, melancholy, hysteria, or hallucinations were all seen as signs that a woman was in league with Satan. If she spoke to herself, she was communing with spirits. If she wept uncontrollably, she was mourning the souls she had damned. If she laughed at nothing, she was mocking God. There was no refuge. Even the quietest gestures became fuel for suspicion. A woman who walked alone in the woods might be gathering herbs for healing or for curses. A woman who mumbled prayers under her breath might be blessing her home or summoning demons. And if she tried to defend herself, her protestations were called lies inspired by the devil. The machinery of accusation was pitiless. Once her name was spoken, the process began. Officials would search her body for the so-called witch's mark, a mole, a scar, a birthmark. Any blemish could be declared proof of a pact with darkness. For women with disabilities, these marks were often plentiful and obvious. The witch-finder's needle was driven into their flesh, and if they did not bleed or flinch, it was taken as certain evidence of guilt. If they screamed or fainted, that too was proof that the devil was resisting exposure. In villages across Scotland and Denmark, crowds gathered to watch the accused dragged to prison. Children were told not to look them in the eye. Adults crossed themselves and spat in their direction. The condemned were isolated from the moment the accusation was made, cut off from any chance to be seen as human. Once the trial began, their fate was almost sealed. No defense could counter the evidence of their bodies. No argument could erase the fear that difference inspired. Some confessed under torture, desperate to end the pain. Others clung to their innocence, only to be hanged or burned as examples to the community. Their deaths were announced as triumphs over evil. But in truth, they were monuments to ignorance. In the annals of witch trials, you will find these women's names, written in the same careful ink as all the others. Yet their stories are especially haunting because their only crime was to live with a body or mind that did not match the expectations of the powerful. They were condemned for what they could not change, for the way they walked, the way they spoke, the way they looked, for the mystery of illness and the inevitability of human difference. Their legacy is a warning that fear, when given the authority of law and the blessing of religion, can justify any cruelty. It can turn the suffering of the vulnerable into a spectacle, their deaths into a lesson, their memories into shadows. In their final hours, many of these women had no one to stand beside them. Families, terrified of sharing their fate, often abandoned them. Neighbors who once accepted their help became eager witnesses against them. And when the sentence was carried out, when the rope was pulled tight or the flames were lit, the crowd turned away satisfied that the threat had been removed. But the true threat was never the women themselves. It was the willingness of ordinary people to let fear define justice. Today, when we study these histories, we have an obligation to remember them not as monsters, but as victims, women who bore society's deepest anxieties and paid the ultimate price. Their stories endure as reminders of what happens when compassion yields to superstition, and when those who are different are not protected but hunted. In the end, their only crime was that they did not fit the narrow image of normal. And for that, they were silenced, their lives extinguished in the name of a righteousness that was anything but righteous.